The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Hills, casting a warm golden glow on the tree-lined streets. A newly painted white house stood proudly at the corner, its porch illuminated by soft porch lights, and the faint sound of laughter and music drifted through the open windows. Inside, everything looked picture perfect. Tom and Brian, a gay couple in their early 30s, had recently realized their dream of adopting a child. After years of waiting, paperwork, and countless interviews, they were finally bringing their new daughter, Lily, into their home. The 6-year-old girl had big, curious brown eyes and a shy smile that had won their hearts the moment they met her. She had come from a foster care system that had promised a brighter future, and they were more than ready to provide it. Brian, the more quiet and reserved of the two, sat on the couch holding a photo album, flicking through the pages filled with memories of their lives before Lily. He turned to Tom, who was busy in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Brian asked, his voice full of both excitement and concern. Tom chuckled, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "We'll figure it out. It's going to be great. She's our daughter now, and we're her family. This is what we wanted, right?" They had spent months preparing for Lily's arrival. Their home had been transformed with toys, books, and a room filled with pink and lavender furniture. Exactly what a little girl would need. They had spoken to other adoptive parents, attended parenting classes, and even reached out to a therapist to ensure that their new life would be full of love and understanding. Everything seemed to be falling into place. The next evening, Lily arrived. She was shy at first, clutching a small stuffed bunny to her chest as they introduced her to her new room. "This is your home now, sweetie," Tom said, gently guiding her to her new bed. Lily just nodded, not saying much, but her big brown eyes scanned everything, taking it all in. For the first few weeks, Lily's silence was the biggest change. She rarely spoke, only nodding or shaking her head in response to questions. Tom and Brian were patient, understanding that this was a big transition for her. But as the days passed, they began to notice something unsettling. Every night, when they tucked Lily into bed, she would whisper something in a language neither of them understood. "What is she saying?" Brian asked one evening, standing in the doorway as Lily muttered softly to herself. Tom shook his head. "I don't know. It sounds like it's not English. Maybe some other language she picked up before the adoption." The couple decided not to make a big deal out of it, attributing it to the trauma she might have experienced in her early years. But as Lily settled into her new life, something changed. One day, Lily suddenly started speaking in clear English. She was no longer the shy, quiet girl she had been in those early days. She was confident, talkative, and asked questions that were beyond her years. At first, Tom and Brian were relieved to hear her speak in full sentences. But as the days went on, they started to notice something strange. Lily's speech was often fragmented, and the words she used didn't always make sense. She would mention people they had never heard of and places they couldn't recognize. At times, it was as if she was speaking from a memory that didn't belong to her. "What's going on, Lily?" Tom asked gently, after she had mentioned a name that neither of them recognized. "Who is Mrs. Arlette?" Lily's face went pale. She quickly shook her head and ran to her room, locking the door behind her. Tom and Brian exchanged worried glances. Something was off. Lily's sudden fluency in English, coupled with the strange memories she was mentioning, began to unsettle them both. They had wanted a happy family, but the more they tried to understand their new daughter, the more they realized that she was hiding something dark, and they were about to learn that their perfect family had a secret they were not prepared for. Lily's sudden transformation from a quiet, reserved child to a confident, talkative one was as baffling as it was unsettling. Tom and Brian were no strangers to the complexities of adoption. They had been through the training, the classes, and the psychological evaluations. They knew that children who came from difficult backgrounds could display strange behavior. But what Lily was now saying went beyond anything they had prepared for. It was a typical Saturday morning when the first real clue came. Tom was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air as he flipped them onto the plate. Brian was sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper, when Lily walked in, her small feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. "Morning, sweetheart," Brian said, looking up from his paper and giving her a warm smile. But Lily didn't smile back. She simply stared at him, her large eyes wide and full of something he couldn't place. Her silence felt different now, as if there was more to it than just shyness. Tom set the pancakes down on the table and turned to Lily. "Do you want syrup, honey?" Lily didn't respond at first. She just stood there looking from Brian to Tom with a strange intensity in her eyes. Then, in a voice that was too calm for a child her age, she said, "They're coming. They'll find us." Brian's heart skipped a beat. He was about to ask what she meant, but Lily turned and walked back to the hallway. The soft thud of her footsteps echoed in the house. Tom looked at Brian, concern creeping across his face. "What does that mean?" "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Brian shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she's still processing something from her past. It might just be a phase." But it wasn't just a phase. Over the next few days, Lily's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started drawing strange pictures, disturbing sketches of what appeared to be people with blank faces and grotesque features. When Tom asked her about the drawings, Lily simply said, "They're the ones who look like shadows." Brian tried to brush it off, but the unease that had settled in his chest refused to go away. Every time Lily spoke, it felt like she was saying things that didn't belong in their home, things that didn't belong in her childhood. It all came to a head one evening when Brian found a strange note under Lily's pillow. It was written in a language neither he nor Tom recognized. It looked like a jumble of characters, swirling in chaotic patterns that made no sense. For the first time since Lily had arrived, Brian felt an icy chill run down his spine. This wasn't something a 6-year-old would write, especially not one who had just started speaking English fluently. He showed the note to Tom when he came home that night. Tom's face grew pale as he examined the odd symbols on the paper. "This is, not something she could have just picked up," he said, his voice low. "Where did she get this? Who wrote this?" Brian swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I don't know, but it's not right." The feeling of dread was becoming unbearable. They had to figure out what was going on with Lily, what she was hiding, but every time they tried to confront her, she would retreat into her own world. She became more distant, more withdrawn, and her once cheerful demeanor seemed to fade into something darker. That night, after they had put Lily to bed, Tom and Brian sat in the living room, discussing their next steps. The situation was spiraling out of control, and they had no answers. The daughter they had so eagerly welcomed into their lives had become a stranger, someone they couldn't understand. "I think we need help," Tom said, his voice heavy with worry. "We need to find out what's really going on with her. Maybe there's something in her past that she hasn't told us about." Brian nodded, though a part of him wasn't sure if he was ready to uncover whatever secrets Lily was hiding. What if it's worse than we think? What if she's not who we thought she was? But before Tom could respond, the soft sound of Lily's voice came from the hallway. "They're here." Both men stood up quickly, rushing to the source of the voice. They found Lily standing in the doorway to the kitchen, her small frame illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, but this time there was no fear, only a chilling sense of certainty. "I told you," she whispered. "They're here." Tom and Brian exchanged a worried glance. Something was terribly wrong. Later that evening, as they tried to settle their minds and gather their thoughts, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. The couple froze. No one ever visited them this late. It was after 9 p.m., and they hadn't expected any company. Tom stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, Brian right behind him. When he opened it, there was, no one there, just a small envelope on the doorstep. Tom bent down and picked it up, his hands trembling. The envelope had no return address, only a single word written on it in bold black letters. "Run." Suddenly, everything seemed to come into focus. The warning, the drawings, the strange language, the note. Someone or something was watching them. It wasn't just Lily they needed to be worried about. It was whoever or whatever had been following her. Tom stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the envelope in his hand. The word "run" seemed to burn into his mind, its ominous simplicity sending a wave of panic through his chest. Brian stood behind him, his hand resting on his shoulder, as if trying to ground him. "Who could have left this?" Brian asked, his voice shaky. He glanced around the darkened street, but there was no one in sight. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, as it always was at this hour. Tom didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. This, this doesn't make sense. It feels like a warning. Brian reached out, gently pulling the envelope from Tom's hand. It was plain and unmarked, except for the single word scrawled on it. There was no return address, no indication of who it had come from. Just run. It's not just the note, Brian said, his voice low and troubled. It's Lily. She's not telling us everything. Tom nodded, his eyes narrowing. We need to find out what's going on. If Lily knows something, we need to get it out of her. We can't keep guessing. The feeling of dread that had been creeping into their lives for weeks now felt like a heavy weight on their shoulders. They had hoped that adopting Lily would be a fresh start, a way to build a family and move forward together. But every step they took seemed to draw them deeper into a mystery that was far darker than they had ever imagined. The following day, Tom and Brian decided to take a more direct approach. They had arranged for a child psychologist, Dr. Susan Adams, to meet with Lily and help her process any trauma from her past. Dr. Adams had years of experience working with children who had been through the foster system, and they hoped she might help unlock whatever secrets Lily was hiding. When Dr. Adams arrived, she was professional and calm, immediately putting Lily at ease. They sat in the living room with Lily perched on a chair across from the doctor, her eyes darting around nervously. Tom and Brian watched from the sidelines, hoping this session would provide some answers. Dr. Adams smiled warmly at Lily. Hi, sweetie. How are you feeling today? Lily didn't respond right away. She fiddled with her stuffed bunny, her fingers trembling slightly. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They're going to take me away. Tom and Brian exchanged uneasy glances, their hearts sinking. Who, honey? Dr. Adams asked gently, leaning forward. Who is going to take you away? Lily's gaze shifted to the floor. The shadows, the ones in my dreams. They come and go. They're always watching me. The room fell silent, the weight of Lily's words hanging in the air. Dr. Adams seemed unfazed, but the tension in Tom and Brian's chest grew thicker by the second. Lily, do you know where they are now? Dr. Adams asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Lily shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. They're not here yet, but they will come. They're always coming. Tom could see that Lily was scared, but there was something in her eyes that told him this wasn't just a child's fear. It was deeper, more real, and it was something she couldn't escape. Dr. Adams sighed softly, sitting back in her chair. Lily, do you remember anything before you came to live with Tom and Brian? Any other place? Any other people? Lily's eyes darted to the corner of the room, and for a moment Tom could have sworn she was seeing something they couldn't. She seemed lost in thought, her mind far away. Before she spoke again, her voice barely audible. I don't remember, but I remember their faces, the ones who come in the dark. They look like me, but they're different. They've been here before. Brian's breath caught in his throat. He stood up and began pacing, his mind running through every possibility. Who were these people Lily was talking about? Why did she seem so certain of their presence? Dr. Adams was still calm, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. Lily, I know it's hard, but if you remember anything else, it's important that you tell me. It could help us understand what's going on. Lily nodded, but it was clear she wasn't ready to share more. She clutched her bunny tightly, her body stiff with fear. After a few more minutes of silence, Dr. Adams finally stood up. I think we need to take a step back. It's clear Lily is carrying something heavy inside her, and we need to be patient. She'll talk when she's ready. Tom and Brian both nodded, but they didn't feel any sense of relief. Anything. The conversation had left them feeling more unsettled than ever. Later that night, as they tucked Lily into bed, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The words Lily had said to Dr. Adams echoed in his mind. They've been here before. Brian stood by the door, watching as Tom gently kissed Lily on the forehead. I'm scared, he whispered, his voice strained. What if she's right? What if something from her past is hunting her? Tom turned to Brian, his face pale and drawn. We need to get to the bottom of this, no matter how dark the truth might be. As they left Lily's room and walked down the hallway to their own, the feeling of being watched seemed to grow stronger. The house, once a place of comfort and hope, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the once safe haven they had built for their family now felt like the very place they were being trapped. The next day, Tom and Brian decided to take matters into their own hands. They would search Lily's past. They would find out where she had come from, who she had been with before the foster system, and who these shadows were that had followed her. But little did they know, what they would uncover would be far more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. The air felt thick with tension as Tom and Brian sat in their small, dimly lit study, the piles of papers and files scattered across the desk doing little to ease their growing unease. They had taken the first steps toward uncovering Lily's past by contacting her former foster homes. The truth, they hoped, lay hidden there. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they had to know more about the girl they had brought into their lives. The first file arrived 3 days after they'd sent out the request. It was from Lily's first foster family, a couple who had raised her for nearly a year before she was moved to the next home. Tom and Brian eagerly opened the file, their eyes scanning each page as they tried to piece together Lily's history. Her birth name was not Lily, it was Natalie Hayes, a girl from a small town in Northern California, born to an unwed mother with a history of drug addiction. The file outlined a troubled early childhood, marked by neglect and repeated visits to Child Protective Services. But it was one line in the report that caught their attention. Natalie displayed unusual behavior. Speaking of figures that could not be seen by others, she referred to them as the Watchers. Tom paused, rereading the sentence. The word Watchers sent a chill down his spine. It was eerily similar to the way Lily had described the shadows. Tom glanced at Brian, whose face was pale as he absorbed the same unsettling information. It was clear that Lily, or rather Natalie, had been speaking of something, someone, that others couldn't see. The report continued with details of her time in the foster system, noting that she was moved between several homes due to her odd behavior. Foster families had found it difficult to connect with her, and social workers noted her frequent refusal to engage with other children. She would often become withdrawn, staring off into space, speaking softly to herself in a language no one could understand. "That's not normal," Brian muttered, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. "She was speaking some language we don't even know?" Tom nodded. "It sounds like she was talking to them, the shadows or the Watchers. But it doesn't make sense. A 6-year-old speaking an unknown language? It's not like she could have made it up." Brian leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "We have to get to the bottom of this. It doesn't feel like a coincidence. This is something deeper, something more dangerous." They had no choice but to dig further. They contacted the second foster home, where Lily had stayed for another year. This time, the file contained even darker details. According to the social workers, during her stay with the second foster family, Lily, then known as Natalie, began to experience vivid nightmares. In one incident, she claimed to have seen a tall, faceless figure standing in her room watching her. She had screamed and refused to sleep alone for weeks after that. The foster parents were concerned for her safety, and Lily's behavior became progressively worse. The most disturbing part of the report was a note that had been added by the foster mother, who had written in clear handwriting. "Natalie says the shadows will come back for her. She says they are angry." Tom and Brian exchanged horrified looks. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image that was emerging was one they weren't prepared for. "This is worse than we thought," Tom said quietly. "She was haunted long before we ever met her." But just as the heaviness of the situation was beginning to settle over them, they came across something far worse, something they hadn't anticipated. Attached to the foster file was a photograph. It was a faded black and white image of a woman standing in front of an old crumbling building. The woman's face was obscured by shadow, but her features were unmistakably sharp. Her eyes, despite the poor quality of the photo, seemed to pierce straight through the lens. Underneath the photo, a brief note was written. "Mother, Claire Hayes, deceased, found under suspicious circumstances, involved with a cult." The word cult was a jarring shock to both Tom and Brian. They had known that Lily's past was difficult, but they hadn't expected something like this. The mention of a cult raised new, terrifying questions. What kind of people had been involved with her mother? And why had she been taken from her birth mother so early in life? We need to know more about this woman. This Claire Hayes, Brian said, his voice shaking. We need to understand what happened to her. Maybe this is connected to Lily's strange behavior. But where could they even begin? They had no leads, no clues as to where to search next. The only thing they had was a name, Claire Hayes, and the cryptic mention of a cult. Tom's mind raced. He knew they had to move fast. Every passing day felt like they were running out of time, and with every new discovery, the danger seemed to grow more tangible. If Lily's mother had truly been involved in something sinister, then they were facing far more than they had ever imagined. We'll start with the police, Tom said, determination creeping into his voice. We have to find out what happened to Claire Hayes. There has to be something in the records. But as they made their plan, a small, quiet voice broke their thoughts. Lily stood in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide. She had been listening. She had been watching. They'll come for you too, she whispered, her voice low and calm, as if she were stating a simple fact. The shadows will take you away. You won't be safe. Tom's heart raced, and Brian's face turned ashen. The room seemed to grow colder, as if Lily's words had somehow summoned a chill. For the first time, they realized that this wasn't just a child's fantasy. The shadows, the watchers, were real, and whatever they weren't going to stop. Tom grabbed Brian's arm, his grip tight as he said, "We need to go to the police now. We don't have much time." But as they rushed toward the door, a noise came from the hallway, a soft, unnatural whisper, followed by a low, guttural sound. Something in the house was moving, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Lily wasn't the only one being hunted. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he and Brian stood frozen at the threshold of the hallway. The whispering sound had stopped, but the air felt thick with a presence they could not see. Tom's instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot, and he could feel the weight of an unseen force pressing down on him. Lily stood in the doorway, her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto the hallway. "They're here," she whispered, her voice shaking, but eerily calm. "They've come." Brian, normally the more composed of the two, seemed to crumble under the tension. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "What do we do, Tom?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. "What if she's right? What if they're really here?" Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He glanced at Lily, who seemed to be in a trance, her gaze unwavering. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Whatever had been haunting her was now in their home, and it was real. "Stay close," Tom said firmly, grabbing Brian's wrist and pulling him toward the staircase. "We're not going to let anything happen to her, but we need to get answers, and we need to do it fast." Without another word, the two men rushed upstairs to the study where they had been researching Lily's past. Tom's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers, searching for any clues that might explain the shadowy figures Lily had spoken of. There had to be something here, some connection to the cult, to her mother, to the horrifying presence that seemed to follow her. Brian, meanwhile, paced back and forth, his anxiety palpable. "We need to get the police involved," he said, his voice shaky. This isn't normal, Tom. We're dealing with something we don't understand." But Tom wasn't so sure the police could help. If Lily's mother had been involved in something as dark and twisted as a cult, he wasn't sure who they could trust. The authorities might dismiss them, label it as a case of paranoia or delusion. They needed to uncover the truth themselves. They needed to understand what they were up against. As Tom sifted through the files, he stumbled upon a piece of paper that had been buried under a stack of documents. It was a police report from several years ago, detailing a fire that had destroyed an old building in the outskirts of town. The report was vague, but one line jumped out at him. The building was linked to the Hayes family and a suspected cult. Tom's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the lead they had been searching for. He quickly scanned the rest of the report, which mentioned that the fire had been deemed suspicious. No one had been able to identify the cause, but several people had been reported missing in the weeks leading up to the incident. The fire had destroyed all evidence, leaving no trace of what had really happened. "They're connected," Tom muttered under his breath. his mind racing. The fire, the cult, Lily's mother. It's all linked. Brian, who had been standing by the window, turned sharply when he heard Tom's words. "What are you talking about?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He grabbed his jacket, throwing it over his shoulders as he headed for the door. "We're going to find out everything we can about that fire. We need to know what happened to the Hayes family, and we need to do it now." Brian hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt. What if we're walking straight into danger? What if whatever's after Lily comes after us next? Tom didn't stop. "We don't have a choice. We have to understand what's going on, Brian. We have to protect her. We'll do this together." The two of them hurried out the door and into the car, their minds racing. The drive was tense, both men lost in their thoughts. But as they approached the outskirts of town, a strange feeling washed over them. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, the silence pressing in on all sides. Tom could feel his skin prickling with unease, and his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following them. The area they were headed to was desolate, an old industrial zone where abandoned buildings had long since fallen into disrepair. It wasn't a place people visited, and the eerie stillness of the place only added to the growing sense of dread that gnawed at Tom's stomach. They arrived at the site of the fire, a charred ruin of bricks and twisted metal. The fire had gutted the building, leaving only a skeletal shell behind. But despite the destruction, Tom could still make out the faint outline of the building's structure, as though the past lingered in the air. "This is where it all started," Brian murmured, his voice barely a whisper as they stepped out of the car. Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. There was nothing here now but destruction. But as he walked closer, something caught his eye. A faint symbol etched into the side of one of the walls. It was a symbol he recognized from the files, a symbol that had been associated with the cult that Claire Hayes had been linked to. The symbol was a series of interlocking circles, with a jagged line cutting through the center. It was simple, but it was unmistakable. This was the sign of the Watchers, the same figures Lily had spoken of, the same figures that had haunted her, that had haunted them. "We're getting closer," Tom said, his voice determined. "We have to find out everything about this cult, and we need to do it fast." They moved deeper into the wreckage, carefully picking their way through the debris. As they ventured further into the ruins, a noise suddenly echoed from somewhere deeper inside the building. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Tom froze. His heart raced, his breath caught in his throat. The noise was followed by another sound, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down his spine. It wasn't coming from any direction they could see, but it was clear that something or someone was inside. Tom and Brian exchanged a look, their fear rising to a fever pitch. This was no longer just about Lily. The shadows, whatever they were, had followed them here. And now they were no longer alone. The low whisper echoed through the crumbling remains of the building, sending a wave of dread over Tom and Brian. They stood frozen, barely breathing, as the eerie sound grew louder, almost as if it were circling around them. Tom's hand instinctively reached for Brian's, squeezing it tightly, as if trying to anchor them both in a world that seemed to be shifting around them. "Did you hear that?" Brian whispered, his voice barely audible. Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the dark, ruined space around them. The walls were charred, the floors cracked and uneven, but in the silence of the abandoned building, the whisper stood out like a glaring warning. It wasn't a human voice. It was something more, a low, guttural sound that made Tom's skin crawl. "We need to leave," Brian urged, his eyes wide with fear. But Tom, stubborn and determined, shook his head. We came here to find answers, and we're not leaving until we do." They moved cautiously through the debris, the weight of their steps echoing in the hollow space. Each creak and groan of the building seemed to heighten the tension, as if the structure itself were alive, watching them. But it wasn't the building that frightened Tom. It was the presence that had followed them here, the presence that had haunted Lily for so long. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and then, suddenly, it stopped. Tom's heart skipped a beat, the silence that followed more oppressive than the sounds that had come before. They stood in the middle of the room, their eyes darting around, But there was nothing. Nothing except the rubble and the remnants of the past. "Where is it coming from?" Brian asked, his voice shaking. Before Tom could respond, a figure appeared in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively stepped in front of Brian, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was tall, draped in a dark cloak, and their face was obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice more confident than he felt. The figure remained silent for a moment, and then, in a voice that was both familiar and alien, it spoke. "The past is not done with you yet," the figure said, its voice like a rasping wind. "The Watchers will not rest until the bloodline is complete." Tom's mind raced. The bloodline. The words Lily had spoken when she first arrived. The whispering presence. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about her. It was about something far bigger. Something ancient. And now it was chasing them. "Why are you doing this?" Tom demanded, stepping forward. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice held steady. "What do you want from Lily? What do you want from us?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering his question. Then it spoke again. The words sent chillingly cold through the air. "You have already given what we need. The child is the key. She always has been. It was always part of the plan." Tom's confusion deepened. The child? Was this about Lily? Was she more than they thought? "You've been watching us," Brian murmured, realization dawning on him. "You've been watching her since she was a baby." The figure nodded slowly, and then, for the first time, it stepped forward, pulling back its hood. Tom's stomach churned as the face that appeared was not what he expected. It was gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through him. The face was familiar. Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was Claire Hayes, the woman who had adopted Lily, the woman who had been her mother. How are you here?" Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "You died in the fire." Claire's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't one of warmth. It was a smile that sent shivers through his spine. "I did die, but the Watchers have ways of ensuring their followers live on. My body may be gone, but my purpose was never fulfilled, and now you have all but handed her to us. Your precious little girl." Tom could feel his knees weaken, his stomach turning. You're part of this cult? You've been manipulating us this whole time?" Claire's smile faded, replaced with a look of cold determination. "I never wanted to, but I had no choice. The cult demands what it needs. And Lily, she was always the key to their resurrection." "Resurrection?" Brian repeated, his voice shaking. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Claire's expression darkened. "The Watchers aren't just spirits. They are beings of darkness, bound by blood and time. They need a vessel to bring them into this world, and Lily, she carries the bloodline. She was born for this. Her mother and I, we were just pawns. The real power comes from her. She is the one who will release them." Tom could feel his world spinning. This was madness. Lily, the innocent 6-year-old they had adopted, was at the center of something far darker than they could have ever imagined. But why? Why her? Claire took another step closer, her eyes now filled with something beyond malice, something far colder. "You've already seen it, haven't you? The things she whispers, the things she sees. She's already begun the transformation. It will soon be complete. And when it is, you will have no choice but to join us." Brian stepped forward, his fear giving way to anger. "No, we won't let you take her. You're sick. This whole thing, it's over. We'll stop you." But Claire only laughed, a soft, hollow laugh that echoed through the ruins. "It's already too late," she said, her voice full of finality. "The Watchers are coming, and when they arrive, nothing will stop them." In that moment, Tom realized just how deep they were in. This wasn't just a fight for Lily's future. It was a battle for their lives, for the very world they knew. And the darkness they had discovered was not going to let them go. They had to stop this before it was too late. The air around them grew heavier as the last words of Claire Hayes hung in the dark, suffocating the room. Tom could feel the weight of them pressing down on his chest, as though the very atmosphere was closing in on him. Brian stood beside him, tense, his fists clenched at his sides, but neither of them moved. The situation was beyond anything they had imagined, and the terror that had once been a distant possibility was now a looming reality. Claire's gaunt face twisted into an eerie grin, the shadows playing across her features, making her look almost otherworldly. "You can't stop what's already begun," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Lily is the key, and when the Watchers rise, the world will fall." Tom's mind raced. They needed a plan. They needed to do something, anything to save Lily and stop whatever madness had taken hold of Claire. He looked at Brian, who met his gaze with a shared determination. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about Lily, about saving her from whatever dark fate she had been bound to. Without another word, Tom grabbed Brian's hand and pulled him toward the door. They couldn't confront Claire directly. She had already revealed her power, and the figure before them seemed more like a phantom than a living person. They needed to get to Lily, and they needed to do it now. But as they reached the doorway, Claire's voice rang out, her tone mocking and chilling. "You think you can just walk away? You can't escape the Watchers. Not now. Not when it's too late." The two men paused, their hands still on the doorframe. There was no escaping this. They had been thrust into a world of darkness and nightmares, and now there was no going back. Tom turned to face her, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "We'll stop this. Lily doesn't belong to you or anyone else. She belongs with us, and we'll protect her." Claire's eyes flared with anger, but her face softened, almost sadly. "You still don't understand, do you? She was never meant to be protected. You're just delaying the inevitable." Before Tom could respond, there was a sudden loud thud from the other room, followed by a shrill, terrified cry. "Lily!" Tom's heart leaped into his throat. Without thinking, he rushed toward the sound, Brian hot on his heels. The hallway leading to Lily's room was thick with dust and cobwebs, the old house creaking underfoot with every step they took. Tom's mind was a blur, his thoughts racing. What had happened? What did Claire mean by the transformation? He was afraid of what they might find, but he couldn't stop now. They reached the door to Lily's room, but when they tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. Tom's panic flared as he pulled at the handle, but it was locked from the inside. Lily's cries echoed through the room. "Please, please help me," she screamed. The sound of her terror made Tom's chest ache. Tom pounded on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lily, it's us! We're here!" But the door remained unyielding. Brian tried to kick it down, but it was solid, the lock seemingly reinforced by some unseen force. "Move!" Tom shouted, his eyes burning with desperation. He stepped back and shoved Brian aside, pulling something from his bag. It was the small crowbar they had grabbed from the shed outside earlier. A makeshift tool, but it was their only option. He inserted it into the doorframe and twisted. The lock snapped with a sharp crack, and the door swung open. What they found inside was a nightmare. Lily was standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Her small hands were clenched into fists, and her body trembled. But it wasn't just her fear that made the sight so chilling. It was the transformation that was starting to take shape. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her breath came in short gasps, almost as if she was suffocating. But it was the shadows around her that terrified Tom the most. They seemed to cling to her, swirling in a dark cloud, like something alive, feeding on her fear. Her eyes, once innocent, had turned pitch black, and a faint glow seemed to pulse from deep within them. "Lily!" Tom cried out, rushing to her side. But as soon as he reached out to touch her, a sudden force sent him crashing against the wall. The air was thick with a low hum now, vibrating with an energy that Tom could feel deep in his bones. The room felt alive with a malevolent presence, and all around him, the shadows seemed to grow larger, closing in. From behind them, they heard the faintest sound, soft footsteps. Tom turned, his heart racing, as he saw Claire step into the room, a look of triumph in her hollow eyes. "It's begun," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "The ritual is almost complete. Lily is ours now. There's nothing you can do to stop it." Brian stepped forward, his eyes wild with fear, but his voice steady. Number, we won't let you have her. Claire's smile grew wider, twisted with malice. You've already failed. She belongs to the Watchers now. She always has. But then, something unexpected happened. Lily, standing in the center of the room, lifted her head, her black eyes locking onto Claire's. A quiet, trembling voice escaped her lips. No, she whispered. I'm not theirs. The words were soft, almost too soft to hear. But in that instant, everything changed. The shadows surrounding Lily began to recoil, shrinking back from her body as if they were being repelled by some unseen force. The humming sound that filled the room grew louder, vibrating with a power that filled the space. The dark energy that had been consuming her seemed to be weakening, its hold on her slipping. Claire's expression faltered, disbelief creeping into her features. No! You're supposed to be the vessel. You're the one who was chosen. Lily shook her head, her voice growing stronger. I belong to myself, she declared, her small fists opening, as if releasing some hidden power. Suddenly, a bright light erupted from her, blinding in its intensity. Claire recoiled, shielding her eyes from the brilliance. The light surged outward, blasting the dark presence from the room in a wave of pure energy. Tom felt a sense of weightlessness, as if the entire room had been lifted by the force of Lily's power. When the light faded, Lily stood alone in the center of the room, her eyes now clear and bright, free from the darkness that had claimed them. The shadows had vanished, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. Claire was gone. The room was silent. Tom and Brian rushed to Lily's side, their hearts overflowing with relief and awe. Lily was back to normal, her fear gone, her body no longer shaking. She looked up at them, her eyes wide with innocence. Are we safe now? She asked softly. Tom and Brian exchanged a glance, a mix of disbelief and joy washing over them. They had done it. They had saved her. Yes, sweetheart, Tom whispered, pulling her into a warm embrace. You're safe. You're finally safe.